Hey, Chopsticks here. What's up? Um, Been a little break here. Been giving my voice a bit of a rest there. A lot of karaoke and stuff. Oh, revelry over the holidays. Couple anxiety attacks. Coming to you live from the underground. At least I'm alive right now. Literally, I'm in a basement. That's my temporary studio right now. Uh, Here we go. We got part two, Project Wepwawet. Hope you like the opening theme there. We'll be doing that. I improv that with the accordion there. All right. Mark Rodan flicked off the switch of his transistor radio and rose from the table, leaving the breakfast tray almost untouched. He walked over to the window, lit another in the endless chain of cigarettes, and gazed out at the snow-encrusted landscape, which the late arriving spring had not yet started to dismantle. Bastards! He murmured the word quietly and with great venom, following up with another sotto-voiced string of nouns and epithets that expressed his feelings toward the French president, his government, and the Action Service. Rodin was unlike his predecessor in almost every other way. Almost every way. Tall and spare, with a cadaverous face hollowed by the hatred within. He usually masked his emotions with an un-Latin frigidity. For him there had been no École Polytechnique to open doors to promotion. The son of a cobbler, he had escaped to England by a fishing boat in the halcyon days of his late teens when the Germans overran France, and had enlisted as a private soldier under the banner of the Cross of Lorraine. Promotion through sergeant to warrant officer had come the hard way, in bloody battles across the face of North Africa, under Koenig, and later through the hedgerows of Normandy with Leclerc. A field commission during the fight for Paris had gotten him the officer chevrons his education and breeding could never have obtained, and in post-war France the choice had been between staying in the army or reverting to civilian life. But revert to what? He had no trade but that of cobbler, which his father had taught him, and he found the working class of his native country dominated by communists, who had also taken over the resistance and the Free French of the interior. So he stayed in the army, later to experience the bitterness of an officer from the ranks who saw a new young generation of educated boys graduating from the officer schools, earning in theoretical lessons carried out in classrooms the same chevrons he had sweated blood for. As he watched them pass in rank and privilege, the bitterness started to set in. There was only one thing left to do, and that was join one of the colonial regiments, the tough crack soldiers who did the fighting while the conscript army paraded round drill squares. He managed to transfer to the colonial paratroops. Within a year he had been a company commander in Indochina, living among other men who spoke and thought as he did. For a young man from a cobbler's bench, promotion could still be obtained through combat, and more combat. By the end of the Indochina campaign he was a major, and after an unhappy and frustrating year in France, he was sent to Algeria. The French withdrawal from Indochina and the year he spent in France had turned his latent bitterness into a consuming loathing of politicians and communists, whom he regarded as one and the same thing. Not until France was ruled by a soldier could she ever be pried loose from the grip of the traitors and lickspittles who permeated her public life. Only in the army were both breeds extinct. Like most combat officers who had seen their men die and occasionally buried the hideously mutilated bodies of those unlucky enough to be taken alive, Rodin worshipped soldiers as the true salt of the earth, the men who sacrificed themselves in blood so that the bourgeoisie could live at home in comfort. To learn from the civilians of his native land after 8 years of combat in the forests of Indochina that most of them cared not a fig for the soldiery, to read the denunciations of the military by the left-wing individuals for mere trifles like the torturing of prisoners to obtain vital information, had set off inside Mark a reaction which, combined with the native bitterness stemming from his own lack of opportunity, had turned into zealotry. He remained convinced that given enough backing by the civil authorities on the spot, and the government and people back home, the army could have beaten the Viet Minh. The cession of Indochina had been a massive betrayal of the thousands of fine young men who had died there, seemingly for nothing. For Rodin there could be, no more betrayals. Algeria would prove it. He left the shore of Marseille in the spring of 1956 as near a happy man as he would ever be, convinced that the distant hills of Algeria would see the consummation of what he regarded as his life's work, the apotheosis of the French army in the eyes of the world. Within 2 years of bitter and ferocious fighting, little happened to shake his convictions. True, the rebels were not as easy to put down as he had thought at first. However many Falaha he and his men shot, however many villages were razed to the ground, however many FLN terrorists died under torture, the rebellion spread until it enveloped the land and consumed the cities. What was needed, of course, was more help from the metropole. Here at least there could be no question of a war in far-flung corner of the empire. Algeria was France, a part of France, inhabited by 3 million Frenchmen. One would fight for Algeria as for Normandy, Brittany, or the Alpes Maritimes. When he got his lieutenant colonelcy, Marc Rodin moved out of the Bled and into the cities. First Beaune, then Constantine. In the Bled he had been fighting the soldiers of the FLN, irregular soldiers, but still fighting men. This term "bled," it's in hieroglyphics in the book, and I believe from reading so much Dune, um, it's a term for the big wide open desert or something like that. All right, back to it. In the Bled he had been fighting the soldiers of the FLN, irregular soldiers but still fighting men. His hatred of them was as nothing compared was as nothing to what consumed him as he entered the sneaking, vicious war of the cities, a war fought with plastic bombs and planted by cleaners in French patronized cafes, supermarkets, and play parks. The measures he took to cleanse Constantine of the filth who planted these bombs among French civilians earned him in the Kasbah the title of the Butcher. This here, this is kind of like one of the beginnings. This time period is we see the beginning of terrorist style activities. Really like the hijackings, all this stuff. It really kicks off uh, in North Africa. They the baddies really get a thing. They learn a lot here. The playbook. We'll say the playbook gets written in Algeria and Libya Ireland, you know. All that was lacking for the final obliteration of the FLN and its army, the ALN, was more help from Paris. Like most fanatics, Rodin could blind himself to facts with sheer belief. The escalating costs of the war, the tottering economy of France under the burden of a war becoming increasingly unwinnable, the demoralization of the conscripts, were a bagatelle. In June 1958, General de Gaulle returned to power as a Prime Minister of France, efficiently disposing of the corrupt and tottering Fourth Republic. He founded the Fifth. When he spoke the words whose utterance in the mouths of the generals had brought him back to the Matignon, and then in January 1959 to the Elysee, Algérie Française, Rodin went to his room and cried. Uh, Algiers Français, it means France is Algeria. Algeria is French. When de Gaulle visited Algeria, his presence was for Rodin like that of Zeus coming down from Olympus. The new policy, he was sure, was on the way. The communists would be swept from their offices. Jean-Paul Sartre must surely be shot for treason. The trade unions would be brought into submission, and the final wholehearted backing of France for her kith and kin in Algeria and for her army protecting the frontiers of French civilization would be forthcoming. Rodin was as sure of this thing as the rising of the sun in the east. When de Gaulle started his measures to restore France his own way, Rodin thought there must be some mistake. One had to give the old man time. When the first rumors of preliminary talks with Ben Bella and the FLN filtered through, Rodin could not believe it. Although he sympathized with the revolt of the settlers led by Big Joe Ortiz in 1960, he still felt the lack of progress in smashing the Fallaha once and for all was simply a tactical move by de Gaulle. Les Vieux, he felt sure, must know what he was doing. Had he not said it? The golden words, Algérie Française? When the proof finally came, when the proof came finally, and beyond any doubt, that Charles de Gaulle's concept of a resuscitated France did not include a French Algeria, Rodin's world disintegrated like a china vase hit by a train. Of faith and hope, belief and confidence, there was nothing left. Just hate. Hate for the system, for the politicians, for the intellectuals, for the Algerians, for the trade unions, for the journalists, for the foreigners, but most of all, hate for that man. Apart from a few wet-eared ninnies who refused to come, Rodin led his entire battalion into the military putsch of April 1961. It failed. In one simple, depressingly clever move, de Gaulle foiled the putsch before it could get off the ground. None of the officers had taken more than a passing note when thousands of simple transistor radios were issued to the troops in the weeks before the final announcement that talks were being started with the FLN. The radios were regarded as a harmless comfort for the troops, and many officers and senior NCOs approved the idea. The pop music that came over the air from France was a pleasant distraction for the boys from the heat, the flies, the boredom. The voice of de Gaulle was not so harmless. When the loyalty of the army was finally put to the test, tens of thousands of conscripts spread out in barracks across Algeria turned on their radios for the news. After the news, they heard the same voice that Rodin himself had listened to in June 1940. Almost the same message. You are faced with a choice of loyalties. I am France. the instrument of her destiny. Follow me. Obey me. Some battalion commanders woke up with only a handful of officers, and most of their sergeants left. The mutiny was broken like the illusions, by radio. Rodan had been luckier than some. 120 of his officers, NCOs, and rankers remained with him. This was because he commanded a unit with a higher proportion of old sweats from Indochina and the Algerian bled than most. Together with the other Putschistes, they formed the Secret Army Organization. That's this SAO. um, pledged to overthrow the Judas of the Palace. Between the triumphant FLN and the loyal army of France, there was little left out time for an orgy of destruction. In the last 7 weeks, as the French settlers sold their life's work for a song and fled the war-torn coast, the secret army exacted one last hideous revenge on what they had to leave behind. When it was over, there remained only exile for the leaders whose names were known to the Gaullist authorities. Rodan became deputy to Argaud as operations chief of the OAS in exile in the winter of 1961. Argaud's was the flair, the talent, the inspiration behind the offensive the OAS launched on metropolitan France from then on. Rodan's was the organization, the cunning, the shrewd common sense. Had he merely been a tough fanatic, he would have been dangerous, but not exceptional. There were many others of that caliber toting guns for the OAS in the early 60s. But he was more. The old cobbler had sired a boy with a good thinking brain, never developed by formal education or army service. Rodan had developed it on his own, in his own way. When faced with his own concept of France and the honor of the army, Rodan was as bigoted as the rest. But when faced with a purely practical problem, he could bring to bear a pragmatic and logical concentration that was more effective than all the volatile enthusiasm and senseless violence in the world. This was what he brought on the morning of March 11 to the problem of killing Charles de Gaulle. He was not fool enough to think the job would be easy. On the contrary, the failures of Petit Clamart and the École Militaire would make it much harder. Killers alone were not hard to find. The problem was to find a man or a plan that had one single factor built in that would be sufficiently unusual to penetrate the wall of security now built up in concentric rings round the person of the president. Methodically, he listed in his mind the problems. For 2 hours, chain smoking before the window until the room became cloudy with a blue haze, he set them up, then devised a plan to demolish or circumvent them. Each plan seemed feasible under most of the critical examination to which he submitted them. Each then disintegrated under the final test. Out of this train of thought, one problem emerged as virtually insurmountable: the question of security. Things had changed since Petit Clamart. The penetration of the Action Service into the ranks and cadres of the OAS had increased to an alarming degree. The recent abduction of his own superior, Argaud, indicated the lengths to which the Action Service was prepared to go to get at and interrogate the leaders of the OAS. Even a blazing row with the German government was not avoided. With Argaud already 14 days under interrogation, the whole OAS leadership had to go on the run. Bidault had suddenly lost his taste for publicity and self-exposure. Others of the CNR had fled panicking to Spain, America, and Belgium. There had been a rush for false papers, tickets to far places. Watching this, The lower ranks had suffered a staggering setback to morale. Men inside France, oh, this guy does not like Oxford commas. He's just like there had been a rush for false papers, tickets to far places. Yeah, and the CNR, others of the CNR had fled panicking to Spain, America, comma Belgium, not Spain, America, and Belgium. Sometimes it's unsettling to me for some odd reason. Anyway, watching this, the lower ranks had suffered a staggering setback to morale. Men inside France previously prepared to help, to shelter wanted men, to carry packages of arms, to pass messages, even to provide information, were hanging up the phone with a muttered excuse. Following the failure of Petit Clamart and the interrogation of the prisoners, three whole networks inside France had to be closed down. With inside information, the French police had raided house after house, uncovered cache after cache of weapons and stores. Two other plots to kill de Gaulle had been swamped with police as the conspirators sat down to their second meeting. While the CNR made speeches in committee and burbled about the restoration of democracy in France, Rodin grimly faced the facts of life as exposed in the bulging briefcase by his bed. Short of funds, losing national and international support, membership, and credibility, the OAS was crumbling before the onslaught of the French Secret Service and police. Arriving at the end of his own argument, Rodin muttered, "A man who is not known." He ran through the list of men whom he knew would not flinch from assassinating a president. Everyone had a file thick as the Bible in French police HQ. Why else would he, Marc Rodin, be hiding in a hotel in an obscure Austrian mountain village? The answer came to him just before noon. He dismissed it for a while, but was drawn back to it with insistent curiosity. If such a man could be found, if only such a man existed. Slowly, laboriously, he built another plan around such a man, then subjected it to all the obstacles and objections. The plan passed them all, even the question of security. Just before the lunch hour struck, Marc Rodin shrugged into his greatcoat and went downstairs. At the front door he caught the first blast of the wind along the icy street. It made him flinch, but cleared the dull headache caused by the cigarettes in the overheated bedroom. Series of brief telegrams informing his colleagues scattered under the aliases across southern Germany, Austria, Italy, and Spain that he would not be available for a few weeks because he was going on a mission. It occurred to him as he trudged back to the humble rooming house that some might think he too was chickening out, disappearing from the threat of kidnap or assassination by the Action Service. He struggled was over. He lunched at the boarding house Stammkarte, the meal of the day being pot roast and noodles. Although years in the jungle and the wilderness of Algeria had left him little discrimination about food, he had difficulty cramming it down. By mid-afternoon he was gone, bags packed, bill paid, departed on a lonely mission to find a man, or precisely a type of man he was not sure existed. As he boarded his train, a BOAC Comet 4B drifted down the flight path towards runway 04 at London Airport. It was inbound from Beirut. Among the passengers filing through the arrivals lounge was a tall, blond Englishman. His face was healthily tanned by the Middle East sun. He felt relaxed and fit after 2 months of enjoying the undeniable pleasures of the Lebanon and the, for him, even greater pleasure of supervising the transfer of a handsome sum of money from a bank in Beirut to another in Switzerland. Far behind him in the sandy soil of Egypt, long since buried by the baffled and furious Egyptian police, each with a neat bullet hole through the spine, were the bodies of two German missile engineers. Their departure from life had set back the development of Nasser's Al Gomoria rocket by several years, and a Zionist millionaire in New York felt his money had been well spent. After passing easily through customs, the Englishman took a hire car to his flat in Mayfair. Now, this is a little put in there. Like if you go looking deep into like Middle Eastern Cold War stuff, there's a lot of rocket scientists that go missing. Uh, anyway, it was 90 days before Rodin's search was over, and what he had to show for it was three slim dossiers, each encased in a manila file which he kept with him permanently in his briefcase. It was in the middle of June that he arrived back in Austria and checked into a small boarding house, the Pension Kleist in the Brucknerallee in Vienna. From the city's main post office he sent off two crisp telegrams, one to Bolzano in northern Italy, the other to Rome. Each summoned his two principal lieutenants to an urgent meeting in his room in Vienna. Within 24 hours the men had arrived. Rene Montclar came by hired car from Bolzano. Andre Casson flew in from Rome. Each traveled under false name and papers, for both in Italy and Austria the resident officers of the SDECE had both men top listed in their files, and by this time were spending a lot of money buying agents and informers at border checkpoints and airports. Andre Casson was the first to arrive at the Pension Kleist, 7 minutes before the appointed time of 11 o'clock. He ordered his taxi to drop him in at the corner of the Brucknerallee, and spent several minutes adjusting his tie in the reflection of a florist's window before walking quickly into the hotel foyer. Rodin had as usual registered under a false name, one of 20 known only to his immediate colleagues. Each of the two he had summoned had received a cable the previous day signed by the name of Schulze, Rodin's code name for the particular 20-day period. Herr Schulze, bitte, Casson inquired of the young man at the reception desk. The clerk consulted his registration book. Room 64. Are you expected, sir? Yes, indeed, replied Casson, and headed straight up the stairs. He turned the landing to the first floor and walked along the passage looking for room 64. He found it halfway along the right. As he raised his hand to knock, it was gripped from behind. He turned and stared up into a heavy blue-jowled face. The eyes beneath the thick single band of black hair that passed for eyebrows gazed down him without curiosity. The man had fallen in behind him as he passed an alcove 20 feet back, and despite the thinness of the cord carpet, Casson had not heard a sound. Vous désirez? said the giant, as if he could not have cared less. But the grip on Kassan's right wrist did not slacken. For a moment Kassan's stomach turned over as he imagined the speedy removal of our gold from the Aden-Wolf Hotel 4 months earlier. Then he recognized the man behind him as Polish foreign legionnaire from Rodin's former company in Indochina and Vietnam. He recalled that Rodin occasionally used Victor Kowalski for special assignments. "I have an appointment with Colonel Rodin, Victor," he replied softly. Kowalski's brows knotted even closer together at the mention of his own and his master's name. "I am André Cassan," he added. Kowalski seemed unimpressed. Reaching round Cassan, he rapped with his left hand on the door of room 64. A voice from inside replied, "Oui." Kowalski approached his mouth to the wooden panel of the door. "There's a visitor here," he growled, and the door opened a fraction. Rodin gazed out, then swung the door aside, then swung the door wide. Blah, 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 blah. "She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. Blah, 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 blah. My dear Andre, so sorry about this." He nodded to Kowalski. "All right, Corporal. I'm expecting this man." Cassan found his right wrist freed at last and stepped into the bedroom. Rodin had another word with Kowalski on the threshold, then closed the door again. The Pole went back to stand in the shadows of the alcove. Rodin shook hands and led Cassan over to the two armchairs in front of the gas fire. Although it was mid-June, the weather outside was a fine, chill drizzle, and both men were used to the warmer sun of North Africa. The gas fire was full on. Cassan stripped off his raincoat and settled before the fire. "You don't usually take precautions like this, Mark," he observed. "It's not so much for me," replied Rodin. "If anything should happen, I can take care of myself. But I might need a few minutes to get rid of the papers." He gestured to the writing desk by the window, where a thick manila folder lay beside his briefcase. "That's really why I brought Victor. Whatever happened, he would give me 60 seconds to destroy the papers. They must be important." "Maybe, maybe." There was nevertheless a note of satisfaction in Rodin's voice. "But we'll wait for Rene. I told him to come at 11:15 so the two of you would not arrive within a few seconds of each other and upset Victor. He gets nervous when there is too much company around whom he does not know." Rodin permitted himself one of his rare smiles at the thought of what would ensue if Victor became nervous with the heavy Colt under his left armpit. There was a knock at the door. Rodin crossed the room and put his mouth to the wood. "Oui?" This time it was Rene Montclair's voice, nervous and strained. "Mark, for the love of God." Rodin swung open the door. Montclair stood there, dwarfed by the giant pole behind him. Victor's arm encircled him, pinning both the accountant's arms to his side. "Ça va, Victor," murmured Rodin to the bodyguard, and Montclair was released. He entered the room thankfully and grimaced at Cassan, who was grinning from the chair by the fire. Again the door closed, and Rodin made his excuses to Montclair. Montclair came forward, and the two shook hands. He had taken off his overcoat to reveal a rumpled dark gray suit of poor cut which he wore badly. Like most ex-army men accustomed to a uniform, both he and Rodin had never worn suits so well. As host, Rodin saw the other two seated in the bedroom's two easy chairs. He kept for himself the upright chair behind the plain table that served him for a desk. From the bedside cabinet he took a bottle of French brandy and held it up inquiringly. Both his guests nodded. Rodin poured a generous measure into each of three glasses and handed two to Montclair and Casson. They drank first, the two travelers letting the hot liquor get to work on the chill inside them. Rene Montclair, leaning back against the bedhead, was short and stocky, like Rodin, a career officer from the army. But unlike Rodin, he had not had a combat command. Most of his life he had been in the administrative branches, and for the previous 10 years in the pay accounts branch of the Foreign Legion. By the spring of 1963, he was treasurer of the OAS. André Casson was the only civilian. Small and precise, he dressed still like the bank manager he had been in Algeria. He was the coordinator of the OAS CNR underground in metropolitan France. Both men were, like Rodin, hardliners even among the OAS, albeit for different reasons. Montclair had a son, a 19-year-old boy who had been doing his national service in Algeria 3 years previously while his father was running the pay accounts department of the Foreign Legion base outside Marseille. Major Montclair never saw the body of his son. It had been buried in the bled by the Legion patrol that took the village where the young private had been held a prisoner by the guerrillas. But he had heard the details of what had been done to the young men afterwards. Nothing remained secret for long in the Legion. People talk. André Casson was more involved. Born in Algeria, he had devoted his entire life to his work, his flat, and his family. The bank for which he worked had its headquarters in Paris, so even with the fall of Algeria, he would not have been out of work. But when the settlers rose in revolt in 1960, he had been with them, one of the leaders in his native Constantine. Even after that, he had kept his job, but realized as account after account closed and the businessmen sold out to move back to France that the heyday of French presence in Algeria was over. Shortly after the army mutiny, incensed by the new Gaullist policy and the misery of the small-time farmers and traders of the region, fleeing ruin to a country many of them had hardly seen across the water, he had helped an OAS unit rob his own bank of 30 million old francs. 30 million old francs. His complicity had been noticed and reported by a junior cashier, and his career with the bank was over. He sent his wife and two children to live with his in-laws at Perpignan and joined the OAS. His value to them was his personal knowledge of several thousand OAS sympathizers now living inside France. Marc Rodin took his seat behind his desk and surveyed the other two. They gazed back with curiosity, but no questions. Carefully and methodically, Rodin began his briefing, concentrating on the growing list of failures and defeats the OAS had sustained at the hands of the French Secret Service over the past few months. His guests stared gloomily into their glasses. We simply must face facts. In the past 4 months, we have taken three severe blows. I don't need to go into the details. You know them all as well as I do. Despite Antoine Argaud's loyalty to the cause, there can be no doubt that with modern methods of interrogation, probably including drugs, this, mind you, this is happening in the middle 20th century, while we're getting into the whole MK Ultra thing and stuff in America and wherever else, they could do stuff with drugs. So like, yeah, that's he likes to stick these he sticks these little bits in here. You gotta remember this is a year zero spy book. So like, there's these little things that sound cliche, but he was inventing it. They were making this up. Probably including drugs, used on him. The whole organization stands in jeopardy from the security standpoint. We have to start again, almost from scratch. But even starting from scratch would not be so bad if it were a year ago. Then we could call on thousands of volunteers full of enthusiasm and patriotism. Now that is not so easy. Now that is not so easy. I do not blame our sympathizers too much. They have a right to expect results, not words. All right. What are you getting at? Said Montclair. Both listeners knew Rodan was right. Montclair realized better than any that the funds gained in robbing banks across Algeria were expended on the costs of running the organization, and that the donations from right-wing industrialists were beginning to dry up. More recently, his approaches had been met with ill-concealed disdain. Casson knew his lines of communications with the underground in France were becoming more tenuous by the week. His safe houses were being raided, and since the capture of Argode many had withdrawn their support. The execution of Bastien Thierry could only accelerate this process. The resume given by Rodan was the truth, but no more pleasant to hear for all that. Rodan continued as though there had been no interruption. We have now reached a position where the prime aim of our cause to liberate France, the elimination of Grand Zora, without which all further Grand Zora is another name for Charles de Gaulle, without which all further plans must inevitably abort, has become virtually impossible by the traditional means. I hesitate, gentlemen, to commit more patriotic young men to plans which stand little chance of remaining unrevealed to the French Gestapo for more than a few days. In short, there are too many squealers, too many backsliders, too many recusants. Taking advantage of this, the secret police have now so completely infiltrated the movement that the deliberations of even our highest councils are being leaked to them. They seem to know, within days of the decision being taken, what we intend, what are our plans, and who are our personnel. It is undeniably unpleasant to have to face this situation, but I am convinced that if we do not face it, we shall continue to live in a fool's paradise. In my estimation, there is only one method remaining to accomplish our first objective: the killing of Zora, in a manner that will bypass the whole network of spies and agents, leave the secret police stripped of its advantages, and face them with a situation not only of which they are unaware, but which they could hardly frustrate even if they knew about it. Montclair and Casson looked up quickly. There was dead silence in the bedroom, broken only by the occasional clatter of rain against the window pane. If we accept that my appreciation of the situation is unfortunately accurate, continued Rodan, then we must also accept that all of those we now know as being both prepared and capable of doing the job of eliminating Grand Zora are equally known to the secret police. None of them can move inside France as other than a hunted animal, not only pursued by the conventional police forces, but betrayed from behind by the barbouzes and the stool pigeons. I believe, gentlemen, that the only alternative left to us is to engage the services of an outsider. Montclair and Casson gazed at him first in amazement, then dawning comprehension. "What kind of outsider?" asked Hassan at length. "It would be necessary for this man, whoever he is, to be a foreigner," said Rodan. "He would not be a member of the OAS or the CNR. He would not be known to any policeman in France, nor would he exist on any file. The weakness of all dictatorships is that they are vast bureaucracies. What is not on file does not exist. The assassin would be an unknown and therefore non-existent quantity. He would travel under a foreign passport, do the job, and disappear back to his own country while the people of France rose to sweep away the remnants of de Gaulle's treasonable rabble. For the man to get out would not in any case be vastly important, since he would in any case liberate him after taking power. Since we would in any case liberate him after taking power. The important thing is that he be able to get in, unspotted and unsuspected. That is something which, at the moment, not one of us can do." Both his listeners were silent, each gazing into his private thoughts as Rodin's plan took shape in their minds also. Montclair let out a low whistle. "A professional assassin." "A mercenary." "Precisely," replied Rodin. "It would be quite unreasonable to suppose that an outsider is going to do such a job for the love of us, or for patriotism, or for the hell of it. In order to get the level of skill and the nerve necessary for this kind of operation, we must engage a true professional. And such a man would only work for money. A lot of money," he added, glancing quickly at Montclair. "But how do we know we can find such a man?" asked Hassan. Rodin held up his hand. "First things first, gentlemen. Evidently there is a mass of detail to be worked out. What I wish to know first of all, is if you agree in principle to the idea." Montclair and Casson looked at each other. Both turned to Rodin and nodded slowly. "Bien." Rodin leaned back as far as the upright chair would allow him. "Then that is the first point disposed of. Agreement in principle. The second concerns security and is fundamental to the whole idea. In my view, there are increasingly few who can be regarded as absolutely beyond suspicion as the possible source of a leak of information. That is not to say I regard any of our colleagues, either in the OAS or the CNR, as traitors to the cause. Not as such. But it is an old axiom that the more people know a secret, the less sure that secret becomes. The whole essence of this idea is absolute secrecy. Consequently, the fewer who are aware of it, the better. Even within the OAS, there are infiltrators who have achieved responsible positions and who yet report our plans to the secret police. These men's time will come one day, but for the moment, they are dangerous. Among the politicians of the CNR, there are those either too squeamish or too gutless to realize the full extent of the project they are supposed to have become committed to. I would not wish to put the life of any man in danger by gratuitously and unnecessarily informing such men of his existence. I have summoned you, Rene, and you, Andre, here because I am utterly convinced of your loyalty to the cause and your ability to retain a secret. Moreover, for the plan I have in mind, the active cooperation of you, Rene, as treasurer and paymaster is necessary to meet the hire that any professional assassin will undoubtedly demand. Your cooperation, Andre, will be necessary to assure such a man of assistance inside France of a small handful of men beyond doubt in case he should have to call on them. But I see no reason why the details of the idea should go further than we three. I am therefore proposing to you that we form a committee of ourselves to take the entire responsibility for this idea, its planning, execution, and subsidiation." There was another silence. At length Montclair said, "You mean we cut out the entire council of the OS, the whole of the CNR? They won't like that." "Firstly, they won't know about it," replied Rodin calmly. "If we were to put the idea to them all, it would require a plenary meeting. This alone would attract attention, and the Barbouzets would be active to find out what the plenary meeting was called for. There may be even there may even be a leak on one of the two councils. If we visited each member in turn, it would take weeks even to get preliminary approval in principle. Then they would all want to know the details as each planning stage was reached and passed. You know what these bloody politicians and committeemen are like. They want to know everything just for the sake of knowing it. They do nothing, but each one can put the whole operation in jeopardy with a word spoken in drunkenness or carelessness. Secondly, if the agreement of the entire council of the OAS and the CNR could be obtained to the idea, we would be no further forward, and nearly 30 people would know about it. If, on the other hand, we go ahead, take the responsibility, and it fails, we shall be no further back than we are now. There will be recriminations, no doubt, but nothing more. If the plan succeeds, we shall be in power, and no one will start arguing at that time. The exact means of achieving the destruction of the dictator will have become an academic point. In brief, then, do you two agree to join me as sole partners, organizers, and operators of the idea I have expounded to you?" Again Montclair and Casson looked at each other, turned to Rodin and nodded. It was the first time they had met with him since the snatching of Argaud 3 months earlier. When Argaud had taken the chair, Rodin had kept quietly in the background. Now he had emerged as a leader in his own right. The chief of the underground and the purse were impressed. Rodin looked at them both, exhaled slowly, and smiled. "Good," he said. "Now let us get down to the details. The idea of using a professional mercenary assassin first occurred to me on the day I heard over the radio that poor Bastien Thiry had been murdered. Since that time I have been searching for the man we want. Obviously such men are hard to find. They do not advertise themselves. I have been searching since the middle of March, and the outcome can be summed up in these." He held up the 3 manila folders that had been laying on his desk. Montclair and Casson exchanged glances again, eyebrows raised, and remained silent. Rodin resumed. "I think it would be best if you studied the dossiers. Then we can discuss our first choice. Personally, I have listed all three in terms of preference in case the first listed either cannot or will not take the job. There is only one copy of each dossier, so you will have to exchange them. So you'll have to exchange them." He reached into the middle of the folder and took out 3 slimmer files. He handed one to Montclair and one to Casson. The third he kept on his own hand, but did not bother to read it. He knew the contents of all 3 files intimately. There was little enough to read. Rodin's reference to a brief dossier was depressingly accurate. Casson finished his file first, looked up at Rodin, and grimaced. "That's all?" "Such men do not make details about themselves easily available," replied Rodin. "Try this one." He handed down to Casson the file he held in his hand. A few moments later Montclair also finished and passed his file back to Rodin, who gave him the dossier Casson had just finished. Both men were again lost in reading. This time it was Montclair who finished first. He looked up at Rodin and shrugged. "Well, not much to go on, but surely we have 50 men like that." "Gunslingers are 2 a penny." He was interrupted by Casson. "Wait a minute. Wait till you see this one." He flicked over the last page and ran his eyes down the 3 remaining paragraphs. When he had finished, he closed the file and looked up at Rodan. The OAS chief gave away nothing of his own preferences. He took the file Cassan had finished and passed it to Montclair. To Cassan he passed the third of the folders. Both men finished their reading together 4 minutes later. I like how he's specific about these minutes. I'm not sure why maybe that it comes into play later in the book. I don't know. Well, I told you it was a small market. There may be more men about who do this kind of work, but without access to the files of a good secret service, they are damned hard to find. And probably the best ones aren't even on any files at all. You've seen all three. For the moment, let's refer to them as the German, the South African, and the Englishman. Andre? Casson shrugged. For me, there is no debate. On his record, if it is true, the Englishman is out ahead by a mile. Rene? I agree. The German is a bit old for this kind of thing now. Apart from a few jobs done for the surviving Nazis against the Israeli agents who pursue them, he doesn't seem to have done much in the political field. Besides, his motivations against Jews are probably personal, therefore not completely professional. The South African may be all right chopping up inward politicians like Lumumba, but that's a far cry from putting a bullet through the president of France. Besides, the Englishman speaks fluent French. Uh, this is a thing here. Lumumba was a real dude. I fell down a rabbit hole studying Africa because of this book, and I don't remember. Maybe he was one of the Congo guys. But anyway, the CIA didn't have anything to do with the downfall of Patrice Lumumba, allegedly. Uh, Rodan nodded slowly. I didn't think there would be much doubt. Even before I had finished compiling these dossiers, the choice seemed to stand out a mile. Are you sure about this Anglo-Saxon? Cassan asked. Has he really done those jobs? I was surprised myself, said Rodan. So I spent extra time on this one. As regards absolute proof, there is none. If there were, it would be a bad sign. It would mean he would be listed everywhere as an undesirable immigrant. As it is, there is nothing against him but rumor. Formally, his sheet is white as snow. Even if the British have him listed, they can put no more than a question mark against him. That does not merit filing him with Interpol. The chances that the British would tip off the SDECE about such a man, even if a formal inquiry were made, are slim. You know how they hate each other. They even kept silent about Georges Bidault being in London last January. No, for this kind of job, the Englishman has all the advantages but one. What's that? Asked Montclair quickly. Simple. He will not be cheap. A man like him can ask for a lot of money. How are the finances, Rene? Montclair shrugged. Not too good. Expenditure has gone down a bit. Since the Argot affair, all the heroes of the CNR have gone to ground in cheap hotels. They seem to have lost their taste for the three-star palaces and the television interviews. On the other hand, income is down to a trickle. As you said, there must be some action, or we shall be finished for lack of funds. One cannot run this kind of thing on love and kisses. Rodan nodded grimly. I thought so. We have to raise some money from somewhere. On the other hand, there would be no point in getting into that kind of action until we know how much we shall need. Which presumes, cuts in Kassan smoothly, that the next step is to contact the Englishman and ask him if he will do the job and for how much. Yes, well, are we all agreed on that? Rodin glanced at both men in turn. Both nodded. Rodin glanced at his watch. It is now just after 1 o'clock. I have an agent in London whom I must telephone now and ask him to contact this man to ask him to come. If he is prepared to fly to Vienna tonight on the evening plane, we could meet him here after dinner. Either way, we will know when my agent phones back. I have taken the liberty of booking you both into adjoining rooms down the corridor. I think it would be safer to be together protected by Victor than separated but without defenses. Just in case, you understand. Uh, you were pretty certain, weren't you? Asked Kassan, piqued at being predicted in this manner. Rodin shrugged. It's been a long process getting this information. The less time wasted from now on, the better. If we're going to go ahead, let us now move fast. He rose, and the other two got up with him. Rodin called Victor and told him to go down to the hall to collect the keys for rooms 65 and 66, and to bring them back up. While waiting, he told Montclair and Casson, I have to telephone from the main post office. I shall take Victor with me. While I'm gone, would you both stay together in one room with the door locked? My signal will be 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The sign was the familiar 3+2 that made up the rhythm of the words Algérie Française that Parisian motorists had hooted on their cars in previous years to express their disapproval of Gaullist policy. Man, does anybody know how to protest like the French? Man. By the way, continued Rodin, does either of you have a gun? And both men shook their heads. Rodin went to the escritoire and took out a chunky MAB 9mm that he kept for his private use. He checked the magazine, snapped it back, and charged the breech. He held it out towards Montclair. You know this fling? I guess he's spelling that F. That's Flingue. I don't. Flingue. Uh, Whatever. 20th century military slang. It's French people. Montclair nodded. Well enough, he said, and took it. Victor returned and escorted the pair of them to Montclair's room. When he returned, Rodin was buttoning his overcoat. Come, Corporal, we have work to do. The BEA vanguard from London to Vienna that evening glided into Schwef. Switched gears to German here. Into Schwechat Airport as the dusk deepened into the night. Near the tail of the plane, the blond Englishman lay back in his seat near the window and gazed out at the lead-in lights as they flashed past the sinking aircraft. It always gave him a feeling of pleasure to see them coming closer and closer until it appeared certain that the plane must touch down in the grass of the undershoot area. At the very last minute, the dimly lit blur of grass, the numbered panels by the verge side, and the lights themselves vanished, to be replaced by black slick concrete, and wheels touched down at last. The precision of the business of landing appealed to him. He liked precision. By his side, the young Frenchman from the French tourist office in Piccadilly glanced at him nervously. Since the telephone call during the lunch hour, he had been in a state of nerves. Nearly a year ago, on leaving Paris, he had offered to put himself at the disposal of the OAS, but since then had been told simply to stay at his desk in London. A letter or telephone call addressed in his rightful name, but beginning, Dear Pierre, should be obeyed immediately and precisely. Since then, nothing until today, June 5th. June 15th, excuse me. The operator had told him there was a person-to-person call for him from Vienna, and had then added, in Austria, to distinguish if it if from the town Vienne in France. Wonderingly, he had taken the call to hear a voice call him "My dear Pierre." It had taken him several seconds to remember his own code name. Pleading a bout of migraine after his lunch hour, he had gone to the flat off South Audley Street and given the message to the Englishman who answered the door. The latter had evinced no surprise that he should be asked to fly to Vienna in 3 hours. He had quietly packed an overnight case, and the pair of them had taken a taxi to Heathrow Airport. The Englishman had calmly produced a roll of notes, enough to buy 2 return tickets for cash. After the Frenchman had nodded he had not thought of paying cash, and had only brought his passport and a cheque-book. Since then, they had hardly exchanged a word. The Englishman had not asked where they were going in Vienna, or whom they were to meet, or why, which was just as well because the Frenchman did not know. His instructions had merely been to telephone back from London airport and confirm his arrival on the BEA flight, at which he was told to report to general information on arrival at Schwechat, all of which made him nervous, and the controlled calm of the Englishman beside him, far from helping, made things worse. At the information desk in the main hall he gave his name to the pretty Austrian girl, who searched in a rack of pigeonholes behind her, then passed him a small buff message form. It said simply, ring 61.44.03, comma. Ask for Schultz. Schulze. I think I'm saying that right. Schulze. He turned and headed towards the bank of public phones across the back of the main hall. The Englishman tapped him on the shoulder and pointed at the booth marked Wechsel. You'll need some coins, he said in fluent French. Not even the Austrians are that generous. The Frenchman blushed and strode towards the money change counter, while the Englishman sat himself comfortably in the corner of one of the upholstered settees against the wall, and lit another king-size English filter. In a minute his guide was back with several Austrian banknotes and a handful of coins. The Frenchman went to the telephones, found an empty booth, and dialed. At the other end, Herr Schulze gave him clipped and precise instructions. It only took a few seconds. Then the phone went dead. The young Frenchman came back to the settee, and the blond man looked up at him. On y va? He asked. On y va. As he turned to leave, the Frenchman screwed up the message form with the telephone number and dropped it on the floor. The Englishman picked it up, opened it out, and held it to the flame of his lighter. It blazed for an instant and disappeared in black crumbs beneath the elegant suede boot. They walked in silence out of the building and hailed a taxi. The center of the city was ablaze with lights and choked with cars, so that it was not until 40 minutes later that the taxi arrived at the Pension Kleist. This is where we part. I was told to bring you here, but to take the taxi somewhere else. You are to go straight up to room 64. You are expected. The Englishman nodded and got out of the car. The driver turned inquiringly to the Frenchman. "Drive on," he said, and the taxi disappeared down the street. The Englishman glanced up at the old Gothic writing on the street nameplate, then the square Roman capitals above the door of the Pension Kleist. Finally, he threw away his cigarette, half smoked, and entered. The clerk on duty had his back turned, but the door creaked. Without giving any sign of approaching the desk, the Englishman walked towards the stairs. The clerk was about to ask what he wanted when the visitor glanced in his direction, nodded casually as to any other menial, and said firmly, "Guten Abend." "Guten Abend, mein Herr," replied the clerk automatically, and by the time he had finished the blond man was gone, taking stairs two at a time without seeming to hurry. At the top he paused and glanced down the only corridor available. At the far end was room 68. He counted back down the corridor to what must be 64, although the figures were out of sight. Between himself and the door of 64 were 20 feet of corridor, the walls being studded on the right by two other doors before 64, and on the left a small alcove partially curtained with red velours hanging from a cheap brass rod. See, I'll tell you what I did when he was describing this building. He didn't really describe the building from the outside. He's just talking about the inside. And so, like, when they were talking about they're going halfway down the corridor earlier, 60 to room 64, I was like, okay, well, there must be roughly 128 rooms in this building. And it's a hotel, so it's maybe got 4 floors at least. This, that, this, that. I'm trying to figure out how big it is. Anyway, he studied the alcove carefully. From beneath the curtain, which cleared the floor by 4 inches, the toe of a single black shoe emerged slightly. He turned and walked back to the foyer. This time the clerk was ready. At, at least he managed to get his mouth open. "Get me room 64, please," said the Englishman. The clerk looked at him in the face for a second, then obeyed. After a few seconds, he turned back from the small switchboard, picked up the desk phone, and passed it over. "If that gorilla is not out of the alcove in 15 seconds, I'm going back home," said the blond man, put the phone down. Then he walked back up the stairs. At the top he watched the door of 64 open and Colonel Rodan appeared. He stared down the corridor for a moment at the Englishman, then called softly, "Victor!" From the alcove the giant Pole emerged and stood looking from one to the other. Rodan said, "It's all right. He is expected." Kowalski glowered. The Englishman started to walk. Rodan ushered him inside the bedroom. It had been arranged like an office for a recruiting board. The escritoire served for the chairman's desk and was littered with papers. Behind it was the single upright chair in the room. But two other uprights brought in from adjacent rooms flanked the central chair, and these were occupied by Montclair and Casson, who eyed the visitor curiously. There was no chair in front of the desk. The Englishman cast an eye around, selected one of the two easy chairs, and spun it around to face the desk. By the time Rodan had given fresh instructions to Victor and closed the door, the Englishman was comfortably seated and staring back at Casson and Montclair. Rodan took a seat behind his desk. For a few seconds He stared at the man from London. What he saw did not displease him, and he was an expert in men. Ooh. The uh, the visitor stood above 6 feet tall, apparently in his early 30s, and with a lean, athletic build. He looked fit. The sun-tanned face had regular but not remarkable features, and the hands lay quietly along the arms of the chair. To Rodin's eye, he looked like a man who retained control of himself. But the eyes bothered him. He had seen the soft, moist eyes of weaklings, the dull, shuttered eyes of psychopaths, and the watchful eyes of soldiers. The eyes of the Englishman were open and stared back with frank candor, except for the irises, which were of flecked gray so that they seemed smoky like the hoar mist on a winter's morning. It took Rodin a few seconds to realize that they had no expression at all. Whatever thoughts did go on behind the smoke screen, nothing came through, and Rodin felt a worm of unease. Like all men created by systems and procedures, he did not like the unpredictable, and therefore the uncontrollable. "We know who you are," he began abruptly. "I had better introduce myself. I am Colonel Mark Rodin." "I know," said the Englishman. "You are Chief of Operations of the OAS. You are Major Rene Montclair, Treasurer. And you are Monsieur Andre Casson, head of the Underground in the Metropole." He stared at each of the men in turn as he spoke, and reached for a cigarette. "You seem to know a lot already," interjected Casson, as he watched three as the three watched the visitor light up. The Englishman leaned back and blew out the first stream of smoke. "Gentlemen, let us be frank. I know what you are, and you know what I am. We both have unusual occupations. You are hunted while I am free to move where I will without surveillance. I operate for money, you for idealism. But when it comes to practical details, we are all professionals at our jobs. Therefore, we do not need defense. You have been making inquiries about me. It is impossible to make such inquiries without the news of them soon getting back to the man being asked about. Naturally, I wish to know who was so interested in me. It could have been someone seeking revenge or wishing to employ me. It was important to me to know. As soon as I discovered the identity of the organization interested in me, 2 days among the French newspaper files in the British Museum were enough to tell me about you and your organization. So the visit of your little errand boy this afternoon was hardly a surprise. Bon, I know who you are, and whom you represent. What I would like to know is what you want." There was silence for several minutes. Casson and Montclair glanced for guidance at Rodin. The paratroop colonel and the assassin stared at each other. Rodin knew enough about violent men to understand the man facing him was what he wanted. From then on, Montclair and Casson were part of the furniture. Since you have read the files available, I will not bore you with the motivations behind our organization, which you have accurately summed up as idealism. We believe France is now ruled by a dictator who has polluted our country and prostituted its honor. We believe his regime can only fall and France be restored to Frenchmen if he first dies. Out of 6 attempts by our supporters to eliminate him, 3 were exposed in the early planning stages, 1 was betrayed the day before the attempt, and 2 took place but misfired. We are considering, but at this stage only considering, engaging in the services of a professional to do the job. However, we do not wish to waste our money. The first thing we would like to know is if it is possible. Rodin had played his cards shrewdly. His last sentence, to which he already knew the answer, brought a flicker of expression to the gray eyes. "There is no man in the world who is proof against an assassin's bullet," said the Englishman. "The Gaul's exposure rate is very high. Of course it's possible to kill him. The point is that the chances of escape would not be too high. A fanatic prepared to die himself in the attempt is always the most certain method of eliminating a dictator who exposes himself to the public. I notice," he added with a touch of malice, "that, despite your idealism, you have not yet been able to produce such a man. Both Pont de Seine and Petit Clamart failed because no one was prepared to risk his own life to make absolutely certain." "There are patriotic Frenchmen prepared even now," began Casson hotly, but Rodin silenced him with a gesture. The Englishman did not even glance at him. "And as regards a professional," prompted Rodin. "A professional does not act out of fervor, and is therefore more calm and less likely to make elementary errors. Not being idealistic, he is not likely to have second thoughts at the last minute about who else might get hurt in the explosion, or whatever method, and being a professional, he has calculated the risks to the last contingency, so his chances of success on schedule are surer than anyone else's. But he will not even enter into operation until he has devised a plan that will enable him not only to complete the mission, but to escape unharmed. Do you estimate that such a plan could be worked out to permit a professional to kill Grand Zora and escape?" The Englishman smoked quietly for a few minutes and stared out the window. "In principle, yes," he replied at length. "In principle, it is always possible with enough time and planning. But in this case, it would be extremely difficult. More so with most other targets." "Why more than others?" asked Montclair. "Because de Gaulle is forewarned, not about the specific attempt, but about the general intention. All big men have bodyguards and security men, but over a period of years without any serious attempts on the life of the big man, the checks become formal, the routines mechanical, and the degree of watchfulness is lowered. The single bullet that finishes the target is wholly unexpected and therefore provokes panic. Under cover of this, the assassin escapes. In this case, there will be no lowering of the level of watchfulness, no mechanical routines, and if the bullet were to get to the target, there would be many who would not panic but would go for the assassin. It could be done, but it would be one of the hardest jobs in the world at this moment. You see, gentlemen, your own efforts have not only failed, but have queered the pitch for everyone else." Now, I don't, that queered the pitch. I'm not sure if that means made the playing field crooked, like like a soccer field. They don't call it a soccer field, they call it a football pitch. Or if that means that or if he means like you've queered the pitch, like you made a crooked cricket throw. Either which way, it doesn't matter. It's the same meaning. Uh, in the event that we decide to employ a professional assassin to do this job, began Rodin. "You have to employ a professional," cut in the Englishman quietly. "And why, pray? There are many men who still would be prepared to do the job out of purely patriotic motives." "Yes, there are still Watan and Kuruche," replied the blond man, "and doubtless there are more Degelds and Bastien theories around somewhere. But you three men did not call me here for a chat in general terms about the theory of political assassination, nor because you have a sudden shortage of trigger fingers. You called me here because you have belatedly come to the conclusion that your organization is so infiltrated by the French Secret Service agents that little you decide remains secret for long. and also because the faces of every one of you is imprinted on the memory of every cop in France. Therefore, you need an outsider. And you are right. If the job is to be done, an outsider has to do it. The only questions that remain are who and for how much. Now, gentlemen, I think you have had long enough to examine the merchandise, don't you? I'm just, I don't want to be like offensive here or nothing, but like this is it like subtly homoerotic in this room or what? Rodin looked sideways at Montclair and raised an eyebrow. Montclair nodded. Casson followed suit. The Englishman gazed out of the window without a shred of interest. "Will you assassinate de Gaulle?" asked Rodin at last. The voice was quiet, but the question filled the room. The Englishman's glance came back to him, and the eyes were blank again. "Yes, but it will cost a lot of money." "How much?" asked Montclair. "You must understand, this is a once in a lifetime job. The man who does it will never work again. The chances of remaining not only uncaught but undiscovered are very small. One must take enough for this job both to be able to live well for the rest of his days and to acquire protection against the revenge of the Gaullists." "When we have France," said Casson, "there will be no shortage." "Cash," said the Englishman. "Half in advance and half on completion." "How much?" asked Rodin. "500,000." Rodin glanced at Montclair, who grimaced. "That's a lot of money." "500,000 new francs?" "Dollars," said the Englishman. "$500,000?" shouted Montclair, rising from his seat. "You are crazy!" "You are crazy?" There we go. There we go. I gotta remember it was a French guy. "You are crazy?" "No," said the Englishman. "No," said the Englishman calmly. "But I am the best, and therefore the most expensive." "We could certainly get cheaper estimates," sneered Casson. "Yes, but the blond man without emotion." "Yes," said the blond man without emotion. "You would get men cheaper, and you would find they took your 50% deposit and vanished, or made excuses later as to why it could not be done. When you employ the best, you pay. $500,000 is the price. Considering you expect to get France itself, you value your country very cheap." Rodin, who had remained quiet through his exchange, took the point. "Touché. The point is, monsieur, we do not have $500,000 cash." "I am aware of that," replied the Englishman. "If you want the job done, you will have to make that sum from somewhere. I do not need the job, you understand. After my last assignment, I have enough to live well for some years. But the idea of having enough to retire is appealing. Therefore, I am prepared to take some exceptionally high risks for that price. Your friends here want a prize even greater. France itself. Oh, France herself. Yet the idea of risks appalls them. I'm sorry. If you cannot acquire the sum involved, then you must go back to arranging your own plots and seeing them destroyed by the authorities one by one." He half rose from his chair, stubbing out a cigarette in the process. Rodin rose with him. "Be seated, monsieur. We shall get the money." Both sat down. "Good," said the Englishman. "But there are also conditions." "Yes?" "The reason you need an outsider in the first place is because of constant security leaks to the French authorities. How many people in your organization know of this idea of hiring any outsider at all, let alone me? Just the three of us in this room. I worked out the idea the day after Bastion theory was executed. Since then, I have undertaken all the inquiries personally. There is no one else in the know. Then it must remain that way, said the Englishman. All records of all meetings, files, and dossiers must be destroyed. There must be nothing available outside your three heads. In view of what happened in February to our gold, I shall feel myself free to call it off if any of you three are captured. Therefore, you should remain somewhere safe and under heavy guard until the job is done. Agreed? D'accord. What else? The planning will be mine, as will the operation. I shall divulge the details to no one, not even to you. In short, I shall disappear. You will hear nothing from me again. You have my telephone number in London and my address, but I shall be leaving both as soon as I am ready to move. In any event, you will only contact me at that place in an emergency. For the rest, there will be no contact at all. I shall leave you the name of my bank in Switzerland. When they tell me the first $250,000 has been deposited, or when I am fully ready, whichever is the later, I shall move. I will not be hurried beyond my own judgment, nor will I be subject to interference. Agreed? D'accord. But our undercover men in France are in a position to offer you considerable assistance in the way of information. Some of them are highly placed. The Englishman considered this for a moment. All right. When you are ready, send me by mail a single telephone number, preferably in Paris, so that I can ring that number direct from anywhere in France. I will not give anyone my own whereabouts, but simply ring that number for latest information about the security situation surrounding the president. But the man on the end of that telephone should not know what I am doing in France. Simply tell him that I am on a mission for you and need his assistance. The less he knows, the better. Send him let him be simply a clearinghouse for information. Even his sources should be confined uniquely to those in a position to give valuable inside information, not rubbish that I can read in the newspapers. Agreed? Very well. You wish to operate entirely alone, without friends or refuge. Be it on your own head. How about false papers? We have two excellent forgers at our disposal. I will acquire my own, thank you. Cassan broke in. I have a complete organization inside France similar to the resistance during the German occupation. I can put this entire structure at your disposal for assistance purposes. No, thank you. I prefer to bank on my own complete anonymity. It is the best weapon I have. But supposing something should go wrong, you might have to go on the run. Nothing will go wrong unless it comes from your side. I will operate without contacting or being known to your organization, M. Kassan, for exactly the same reason I am here in the first place, because the organization is crawling with agents and stool pigeons. Kassan looked fit to explode. Montclair stared glumly at the window, trying to envisage raising $500,000 in a hurry. Rodin stared thoughtfully back at the Englishman across the table. Calm, Andre. Monsieur wishes to work alone. So be it. That is his way. We do not pay $500,000 for a man who needs the same amount of mollycoddling our own shooters need. What I would like to know, muttered Montclair, is how we can raise so much money so quickly. Use your organization to rob a few banks, suggested the Englishman lightly. In any case, that is our problem, said Rodan. Before our visitor returns to London, are there any further points? What is to prevent you from taking the first $250,000 and disappearing? Asked Hassan. I told you, messieurs, I wanted to retire. I do not wish to have half an army of ex-Paras gunning for me. I would have to spend more protecting myself than the money I have made. It would soon be gone. And what, persisted Hassan, is to prevent us waiting until the job is done and then refusing to pay you the balance of $500,000? The same reason, replied the Englishman smoothly. In that event, I should go to work on my own account, and the target would be you three gentlemen. However, I don't think that will occur. Do you? Rodan interrupted. Well, if that is all, I don't think we will need to detain our guest any longer. Oh, there is one last point. Your name. Do you wish to remain anonymous? Should you have a code name? Do you have any ideas? If you if if you wish to remain anonymous, you should have a code name. Do you have any ideas? The Englishman thought for a moment. Since we have been speaking of hunting, what about the jackal? Will that do? Rodan nodded. Yes, that will do fine. In fact, I think I like it. He escorted the Englishman to the door and opened it. Victor left his alcove and approached. For the first time, Rodan smiled and held out his hand to the assassin. We will be in touch in the agreed manner as soon as we can. In the meantime, could you begin planning in general terms so as not to waste too much time? Good. Then bonsoir, Monsieur Chacal. I guess Chacal is French for jackal. The Pole watched the visitor depart as quietly as he had come. The Englishman spent the night at the airport hotel and caught the first plane back to London in the morning. Inside the Pension Kleist Rodan faced a barrage of belated questions and complaints from Cassan and Montclair, who had both been shaken by the 3 hours between 9 and midnight. $500,000? $500,000, Montclair kept repeating. How on earth do we raise $500,000? We may have to take up Chacal's suggestion and rob a few banks, answered Rodan. I don't like that man, said Cassan. He works alone, without allies. Such men are dangerous. One cannot control them. Rodan closed the discussion. Look, you two, we devised a plan. We agreed on a proposal, and we sought a man prepared to and capable of killing the President of France for money. I know a bit about men like that. If anyone can do it, he can. Now we have made our play. Let us get on with our side and let him get on with his. That's it for today. Thank you. The conspiracy is heating up, is it not?